It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us, Gregory Viscusi, reporter at Bloomberg News. How are you?
I'm fine.
Also joining us, Paul Taylor, contributing editor to Politico.
Hi there.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Catherine Field, Europe correspondent for New Zealand Media and Entertainment.
Bonsoir.
Thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here.
And France 24's very own Douglas Herbert. How you been?
Francois.
All right. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag World This Week. Bastille Day came early this year to Washington. The President of the United States opting for a 4th of July like, well, none before, with planes, tanks, and a memorable history lesson on independence from King George's Britain.
The faraway king would soon learn a timeless lesson about the people of this majestic land. Americans love our freedom, and no one will ever take it away from us.
Majestic. Gregory Viscusi.
Oh, his speech could have been worse, huh? I think some people were expecting worse. I mean, at least he did tone down the self-promotion and the campaign stuff. It was just sort of, love America fest. And in his speech, he did mention, the civil rights movement. He mentioned suffragettes. So it was a little bit more inclusive and less political than one might have feared. But I think standards have dropped. The bar is low.
A few historical inaccuracies sprinkled in.
You agree, though, it could have been worse?
Well, anything could have been worse. It was a what was it? It was a laundry list. It was a litany. I mean, he covered everything from, he went all through all the branches of the military, one by one. His Revolutionary War, when I was talking about the inaccuracies, what we are going to take away, what a lot of people are going to take away are the memes that are now circulating, on Twitter. They've gone viral of showing Washington on the Potomac. Let's now storm the airports,
I got one of Washington in the cockpit of an F-16.
That's what we were all waiting for, right? It's easy to laugh at these things, but it does show that it genuinely is sometimes a bit dangerous when he veers off script. And even if it's true, he did stay, by Trump standards at least, non-political. He didn't take, pot shots, direct ones at his Democrats or the other rivals in this election. Still, he did go off script, and he shot himself in the foot in doing so.
Yeah, but come on, why are we here praising a guy who managed to read or almost read what was on the teleprompter?
Sorry.
The bar.
Where are my standards? Sorry.
Yeah, but the bar is really low. But I think where he was on dangerous ground is the emblems, the invention of tradition. He was pulling on those emblems, flags, anthems, all these things that he will use to try and give himself a bit of gravitas. And that was just disgusting. This is, Banana Republic stuff, as the Washington Post
why is
said.
it Banana Republic stuff? I'm sorry to be contrarian, but why is it Banana Republic stuff when it's done in Washington, but not when it's done in Paris? I got a funny WhatsApp message from a friend of mine in the American military. I said, real superpowers don't need to do this stuff. He was against it. But,
And a lot of French people this week have been sort of perhaps
Russians
thinking about that
because French do it.
Because we have this giant military parade. No one else in Western Europe does it.
Top hats on and march past the Queen. Why shouldn't America do such a thing? Whatever you think of Donald Trump.
But isn't it this fact that this is Independence Day? This is a family event. If you're going to have this sort of event, have it on Veterans Day.
He tried to have the parade.
Yeah,
on
exactly.
Veterans
Yeah,
Day, but it was scuttled. But
I was going to say, I don't think it was his fault that it isn't on Veterans Day.
The American 4th of July, we were talking about this once. It's never been a military display. Yes, early in the history there were military processions. Thomas Jefferson watched them. I think James Polk, But it's traditionally been a time of unity. It's been a time of sort of a shared values, which is why a lot of the U.S. headlines on this day were about the parallel universe spectacle of the Independence celebration, which was happening, at the Capitol and the National Symphony Orchestra, and that was a totally different crowd. You didn't see the MAGA hats at that parallel celebration.
All right, showdowns with Donald Trump over trade and Iran. Just some of the challenges that await the new team to come out of some epic all-nighters in Brussels. The EU 28 putting aside calls for Spitzenkandidaten, that is, lead candidates from recent European elections, to get the top jobs. And instead, there was some good old-fashioned Franco-German compromise.
We have chosen 2 women and 2 men for the 4 key positions. A perfect gender balance. I am really happy about it. After all, Europe is a woman.
After all, Europe is a woman, Gregory Viscusi.
I mean, I think you got to hand it to them that in the end they came up with a pretty good team. You know, as Bismarck said, you don't want to see how laws get made. It's like watching sausages getting made. And having sat through this in Brussels, it was not a pretty process to get to where they got to. But I mean, maybe Paul disagrees. But I think it's a pretty good team.
I mean, if they, given that they've decided they don't need a central banker to run the central bank, you can question whether they've necessarily got the optimal team.
But we can get to that later. I think there's some good reasons for this one.
I think that the claim that it would have been more democratic for these Spitzenkandidaten to have got it when they weren't on the ballot in every country, there weren't transnational lists running in this election, and so on.
And when the main parties lost votes.
Phony, and I think that's just the European Parliament, which, as usual, wants more power for itself, and it's a self-aggrandizing organization.
But you had a higher turnout in those European elections, and people
higher than the very high abstention rates that we'd been having, and that's good. But the fact is that
is it a letdown though for the people who voted, the new people who voted?
The Conservatives picked a guy called Manfred Weber who had no government experience. He was on the ballot in Germany only. In Germany, his party lost votes compared to previous time. Even in his own home state of Bavaria, they lost votes, and this guy was unable to unite other groups behind him to create the majority he would need in Parliament. So it was Parliament that decided, actually, that this guy was not going to be President of the Commission. And what went wrong this time is that normally in European appointment processes, the first round of characters all fall on their swords, and their bodies are sort of schlepped off the stage, and then we have a new group of candidates. This time, they kind of wouldn't lie down. They were dead, but the corpses were still twitching, and so that's what
because of the stubbornness of the People's Party.
Yeah, so that's what kept it going for so long.
Gregory Viscusi, you followed this because there was a genesis of a compromise at the G20 summit last week when Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron sat down. You were there for that, and then they went off to Brussels, and you followed them there.
Not quite clear how much of an agreement was made in Osaka. There's a little bit of confusion about that. I mean, people suddenly in the middle of the night, Sunday night, this term Osaka Accord came up as if it had all been agreed by the Europeans in Osaka. The Italians certainly were not part of it, which was why they rejected it from the start. It seems that they just put their minds together and realized, as Paul was saying about the parliament, that there's no way Weber could get the majority, but that Timmermans, who was the Spitzenkandidat of the socialists, by putting together the Greens and the Liberals, who are more amenable to vote for him but would never vote for Weber, partly because he has no experience, he's just not qualified, that possibly Timmermans could get a majority. And so this is this idea that came from Osaka and was brought to Brussels, but one, it wasn't particularly worked out because Timmermans was not particularly popular amongst, and the EPP was the People's Party was not going to buy that, and two, it's not quite clear who actually signed up to this agreement, how wholeheartedly Merkel and Macron were behind this agreement. So I think it's a little much to say that there was an Osaka Accord. I think there was
Merkel abstained, right? She didn't even cast a vote.
Well, that's another issue coming out.
Well, she did it out of political astuteness because she's in a coalition government with the Social Democrats.
Students, because she didn't have the okay of her partners.
Because her authority is ebbing, by the day.
Yeah.
So having a close Merkel ally, Ursula von der Leyen, who was the defense minister up till now, be the one who replaces Jean-Claude Juncker as president of the European Commission. Catherine Field, your thoughts?
I think you have to look at who they've put forward. They all represent Europe. They are centre-right, Christian Democrats. They're going to look after Europe. They're federalist, and it's all pretty safe. Whether or not Ursula von der Leyen gets the green light from the European Parliament, I don't know what you think, Paul, but they'll probably do some sort of deal beforehand to make sure she gets the votes. But she was sort of the last one left standing. She was not very successful as a defence minister in Germany. She wasn't enormously successful as the home and family minister. So they needed to find a job for her, and she fitted the criteria that Merkel wanted. A woman, she speaks French and English.
I mean, she was defence minister in a country that isn't really sure it wants defence at all. And so, that's always been a kind of an ejector seat. It's been a hiding-to-nothing job. But she was a good minister in her previous posts in the government. And I think, she's clearly somebody who has very strong European credentials. And what this is we're seeing, actually, in response to Euroscepticism, in response to the nationalists and the populists that have risen around a number of countries in Europe. This is the core old Europe, the Europe of the 6, perhaps the Europe of the 12, because there's a Spaniard in there as well, saying, wait a second, we're going back to basics. We're going to circle the wagons around the core Europe. Maybe this will lead to more of a multi-speed Europe with Western Europe advancing faster in integration. What it showed was that the East Europeans who were unhappy and blocked Timmermans, they may have blocking power, but nobody wants to give an inch to them on things that matter to a lot of Europeans: values, the upholding the rule of law, democracy, freedom of speech, independence of judges, and things like that.
So two-speed Europe, it's more than just regarding the euro and the monetary union. We're more and more headed towards this Europe where, as you say, they don't budge, and then sort of the outcasts.
I think what this shows is that Western Europe is determined to move ahead and to go on moving ahead, and whether other countries want to join or stay out will be up to them.
Douglas Herbert, we've seen first with predecessors of Ursula von der Leyen, José Manuel Barroso, he leaves and gets a job at Goldman Sachs. That didn't go down very well.
That's true.
Jean-Claude Juncker graduates from being Prime Minister of Luxembourg to the Commission President. Then we have the LuxLeaks scandal.
Of course.
So there's a lot riding on her getting it right.
On her and every, and it. First of all, I just have, it's mission impossible to choose these people, right? Because, of all the factors you have to take into consideration, right? The balancing the big and the large states, geographical, the north and the south. Getting the gender parity. But, I mean, you could almost say that they're up against a task that they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. She is going to have, obviously, all the scrutiny on her. And the fact that, yes, her record in Germany, as we were just saying, is a little lackluster, to put it mildly. But that said, I mean, I'm sorry, but the fact that you do have a woman for the first time in perhaps the most powerful post in the European Union, I think people are going to be looking hard at it. I think there's a lot of people who are going to want her to succeed, even if there's a lot of people right now out of the starting blocks, trying to find quibble and find fault with her and parsing through her CV or her resume there. I do think that there is a general thirst and an appetite.
And she ticks a lot of boxes because, I mean, on the one hand, she's definitely a committed European. She was born in Brussels. She speaks, endless languages, but she's got 7 kids. So
she has 7 kids.
So she can also please the traditionalists at the same time.
Yeah. Revisiting,
she's a qualified medical doctor.
Yeah.
Revisiting the dig I heard from Paul Taylor at the outset of this discussion regarding the choice for the next head of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, to replace Mario Draghi. And there are criticisms that she is a lawyer by training, not an economist, not a central banker.
Yeah. Well, who else is a lawyer by training? The head of the Federal Reserve. So you've got Powell. He's so.
And it has become.
I mean, there's a precedent's been set. Precedent's been set.
Choosing your advisors is
I think, first of all, she's not got central banking monetary experience, but she's been a French Treasury Minister, and she's run the IMF, and she's dealt with the worst financial crisis we've had in a while. She was reconfirmed at the IMF. She clearly has credentials. And then there's another point to be made that as far as all the monetary modeling and all that stuff, the ECB has got some of the best people in the world. She's going to have all the best advice. maybe do need a politician in that role because, like her, because the ECB has, I mean, as Draghi said in one of his last press conferences, ECB has used up its ammunition. There's not much left from a central banking monetary point of view, interest rate point of view that the central bank can do. So you need someone at the central bank who can, convince the Germans that they've got to loosen up on stimulus, that can convince the Dutch that they've got to loosen up on their paranoia about EU budgets, that can convince the Italians that they've got to get serious and make and not just sort of inflate the economy, but make sort of proper liberalizations and structural changes. So I don't think it's a bad choice.
But you say that, and you say that she's going to have to do all this. She's going to have to know what she's doing. And if you're not an economist and you're
She's
going
run the IMF and was
come on, that's a diplomatic post.
Is it easier? Paul Taylor, is it easier running the IMF or having to stare down Germany's Jens Wiedmann at a European Central Bank meeting?
Well, I think if you're going to stare down Jens Wiedmann, you better know the difference between your Phillips curve and your Taylor rule.
Well, Weidmann's been wrong about everything for 10 years.
He has been wrong, and that's why
but he's got clout.
Strongly of the view that he should not get that job.
So,
and one of the good things about Christine Lagarde getting it is that she's not Jens Weidmann, right? And I agree with Greg that if she is able to use her political savvy to convince European governments that have fiscal space to actually spend more, invest more in public infrastructure, do more themselves to get the economy revived, because indeed the ECB's toolbox is starting to look a bit threadbare, that will be great. The only thing is when the excrement hits the ventilator in the middle of the night, you've got to know what you're doing. And Mario Draghi was a leader. He was somebody who was willing to go out ahead of the pack, to take a risk and to say the magic words, whatever it takes. And as a central banker who will have to unfortunately remain anonymous said to me this week, we've gone from whatever it takes to whatever.
When we come back, we'll have more on this and plenty of other stories you're watching the world this week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us, Gregory Viscusi of the Bloomberg News Agency. Paul Taylor, contributing editor to Politico. We're with, as well, Catherine Field of New Zealand Media and Entertainment. And France 24's very own Douglas Herbert. Just before the break, we were talking about the reshuffle in Brussels and in Frankfurt at the top institutions. Among those, Josep Borrell. His confirmation, though, as Federica Mogherini's replacement as EU foreign policy chief, well, that has to wait till the third week of July. In the meantime, he's still very much the Spanish foreign minister. And when British Coast Guards seized an Iranian tanker allegedly bound for Syria this week, Borrell reminded us that them are disputed waters since 1713.
Of course, we were aware of this operation. Civil Guard patrol boats were guarding the area, but we are studying the circumstances in which it happened. It was a demand by the United States to the United Kingdom, and we are looking into how it affects our sovereignty, because it happened in what we understand as Spanish waters.
How's he going to do, Paul Taylor, when he has to speak for all of the EU?
Well, he's already got the forked tongue well practiced, as you just heard. I think that he's got a lot of experience. He is soft-spoken. He has managed to keep that Gibraltar issue with the UK out of the mess of the Brexit negotiations by and large, and yet it's very sensitive domestically.
But he got to dig in there. We heard it.
But he has one or two real difficulties faced. In fact, this Iran ship thing may have blown over by the time he gets on. But he's the man who will be in charge of running the negotiations between Serbia and Kosovo. And his country doesn't recognize Kosovo, and it doesn't recognize it because of the precedent that they believe that would create in terms of the right of Catalonia to claim independence. And so how he's going to manage that, I think that's going to take all of his juggling skills. He's certainly more senior with more gravitas probably than the two previous incumbents of the job, and maybe that means that European foreign ministers will be a bit more willing to let the European foreign policy chief actually do more on their behalf, because the fact is that the big beasts in London and Berlin and Paris haven't wanted the person holding that job to have very much power so far.
All right, we'll see how that plays out. Staying in the Mediterranean, while EU leaders were divvying up top jobs, Carola Racketa, the 31-year-old captain of a German rescue boat, was taking that decision to force an Italian naval blockade and take 40 rescued migrants to dry land in the island of Lampedusa. Enter the Italian Interior Minister, Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini of the far-right League, who relishes the prospect of a lawsuit by Racketa after her brief detention. Gregory, here, translate for us what he says in that tweet there.
I don't have my glasses, so I can't see.
I've got it. He says that he's faced down the mafia, so he's not scared of the mafia, so he certainly won't be scared of dealing with a rich, spoiled German communist.
Yes, exactly.
A rich, spoiled German communist.
So figure a rich and spoiled communist, German communist, exactly.
And then he sends her kisses.
Sends her kisses, yes.
Yeah.
Gregory Viscusi.
Oh, it's a complicated issue, this one, because, I mean, obviously, refusing to allow people who've been rescued at sea to dock is inhumane. On the other hand, look at it from the Italian point of view. It's very nice of a German boat to go up to Libyan waters, collect people, drop them off in Italy, and then have German policemen on the border with Austria. There are German policemen on the border with Austria to prevent migrants leaving Italy. There are French police who block them from leaving Italy into France. So, it's very nice of these Northern Europeans to deliver migrants to Italy and then say, oh, well, don't come any further north.
Yeah, but look, the immediate issue here, beyond just the political questions, the immediate issue is these weren't just migrants picked up at sea. They were migrants who were, a lot of them very sick, a lot of them very traumatized.
No, the sick ones have been taken off. The sick ones have been taken off earlier.
Some of them have been evacuated.
To Italy, quite a lot of them.
And just remember, they had been just drifting there for weeks, literally. I mean, it's not like they before she made that forced docking.
Oh, but they were on the Sea Watch.
Yeah,
though.
they were.
They were picked up by Sea Watch within hours of leaving Libyan shores.
But their condition had been deteriorating rapidly. So there was, separating the political issue, there was a pressing humanitarian issue.
Definitely.
And also the practical issue that it would have been a violation of the international laws, right? Had they returned them to Libya, which is not under international estimation a safe port, in quotes.
No, I say it's not an easy issue. It's not.
She would have been actually breaking the law if
which is why the
to
Italian judge let her go. There was one hearing in front of an Italian judge and she was free.
Despite the perils, expect more migrants to try their luck after the airstrikes against a migrant detention center on the outskirts of Tripoli that have left at least 53 dead. This is a closed circuit footage of that bombing attributed to forces loyal to Khalifa Haftar. His eastern militias deny responsibility. They're trying to take the capital. The UN accusing guards of shooting at those trying to flee. Migrants claim they were forced to work at a munitions depot there. And, those rescued subsequently saying they're ready to risk their lives.
There is a war that is going on in Libya, and then people are not living like over 6 months. People are sitting there with no work. Even food, you have to call your people to help you for food.
Black people are considered as animals in Libya. We are not considered at all. We got sold. Our women are raped. No health care for our children.
Picking up on what Gregory says, this isn't Italy's responsibility alone.
No, it's not. And the European Union has got to start looking at it, getting a grip on it, because it's just been going on. And so far, what the European Union has been doing has been putting a Berlin Wall across the Sahara. That's essentially what they've done. They've moved Europe's border to the Sahara. There they've put in the police, military to help all sorts of security arrangements, and also they've stepped up the returns for migrants who arrive in Libya so they can go home. They're going to have to actually do something more than just do this piecemeal, bit here, bit there. Whether or not this team with Joseph Borrell will be able to finally get some sort of agreement, or if they're just going to continue with this putting more money into Morocco to stop the boats.
I mean, you know, they're trying to pay others to deal with the problem for them, and then there's a degree to which they can be successful with that, with Libya and so on. And the truth is that the numbers of people crossing the Mediterranean are way down. You know, 3,000 people have come into Italy this year. You know, there were that many coming in a week at the peak. So it's way down. But Europe must seize this opportunity to actually reform the asylum and immigration system, so that there's a fairer sharing of the burden, and so that Italy isn't left alone. And then, hopefully, Mr. Salvini will no longer be able to make political capital out of it in the disgraceful way he's doing every week.
All right, perhaps a turning point for Hong Kong's mass protests. Mothers rallying this Friday in a park hours after students rejected closed-door talks with the executive. They wanted the meeting to be public. We're also getting news of the first court prosecution related to Monday's brief takeover of the Legislative Council. Several hundred students at the tail end of a mass rally. It was to mark the 22nd anniversary of Britain's handover of the territory to China, taking over the chamber and briefly deploying the old colonial flag, Catherine Field. And we saw, especially with the deployment of that flag and the graffiti spray painted inside the chamber, divisions within Hong Kong's opposition.
Yes, there are divisions. I personally agree with the theory that they were let into the Legislative Council. The police pulled back a couple of hours before. It was a trap, I think, so as they would have an excuse to really go in there and knock heads together, or even worse, which is probably what the authorities are going to do, is to get them all before the courts, put them away. Their names will be dragged through the Hong Kong press. 70% of the Hong Kong press is owned by mainland Chinese publishers, lots with links to the Chinese government. So their names will go through the press. They will be hounded. Their families will be hounded. None of it is good. Certainly a shame they fell into the trap, went in there. And putting up the colonial flag, that really was a red flag to the Chinese president. They couldn't have done anything.
Plays into the whole Chinese argument that this is just, foreign powers trying to subvert, China's sovereignty over Hong Kong, meddling by foreign powers. That if you couldn't give more as a gift in that narrative to China.
Yeah, statements calling for the respect of rule of law by the UK Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt were amplified and denounced over in Beijing.
The so-called freedom of Hong Kong residents was won by the British. That's a shameless statement. I would like to ask Mr. Hunt what democracy Hong Kong had during British colonial rule. Hong Kong people didn't even have the right to march on the streets.
Yeah, Britain sort of, was a late comer to support for democracy in Hong Kong, just as it was leaving when Chris Patten was the last governor and he tried to create some of the rights that the UK had signally failed to create during its 100-year tenure of Hong Kong. But I think if you're the Chinese government, you've got a real dilemma there, because you can't allow the bits of the country to start falling apart and breaking off, and they accepted the principle one country, two systems when they took Hong Kong back from the UK in 1997. But this cannot mean that people go in and smash up the legislature, or that they, essentially reject Chinese rule. And, the Chinese see knock-ons for Taiwan, they see knock-ons for Tibet, they see knock-ons for Xinjiang, where they're doing some pretty horrendous stuff to the Uyghur minority there. Seen from Beijing, they have to hold the country together. And that means probably making an example of some of these kids in Hong Kong.
Yeah, they do have to keep it together. I think it's a mistake to believe that this is an anti-China rally. That this isn't everyone saying the Chinese out, we want to go back and be an independent country. That's not that at all. It has been the steady erosion of every civil liberty that Hong Kong has had. You're quite right, Paul. I was based there for 4 years up until the handover. They didn't have a lot of democracy. They didn't have elections. But it's got worse under China. The wording of the joint declaration declaration is very vague. It talks about aims, about aspirations for democracy. Well, there's nothing there. But I think the other point, which we're seeing in the UK, is the UK is absolutely powerless for doing anything about this now. They say that they can write a report to the UN. It can be filed with the UN, and it will no doubt be a very substantial report highlighting all the points.
And in that statement we heard from the Chinese Foreign Ministry seems to be overplaying what Jeremy Hunt actually said. Human rights activists feel the UK didn't go far enough.
No, it didn't go anywhere near far enough. But what can it do? Britain is now a very weak nation. It is just about out of the EU, so it can't go back to the EU and say, help us out like they did with the Russian poisoning. They can't. They have no moral standing. They can't send an aircraft carrier down there because they haven't got any that work at the moment. One's still being built, the other's in dry dock because the commander's been relieved of his command because he used the Royal Navy car to go shopping. They can't send a submarine down there. There is absolutely nothing that the Brits can do. And here I think we're also seeing this sort of post-Brexit Britain. It has no moral standing. It cannot do a thing because at the end of the day, they're now hoping to get a great trade agreement.
Britannia no longer rules the waves.
It doesn't. What can they do? They're going to commandeer a cross-channel ferry and sail it around Hong Kong Island with the Union Jack on it a couple of times. It's nothing.
Obviously, it's sensitive in the UK, especially since the foreign minister in question is running for prime minister in an election which probably is not the most democratic way to choose your prime minister either, with a selectorate of 160,000, mostly male, mostly old, and almost entirely white voters.
I was wondering when Brexit
members of
would
the
crop up into
Conservative
the
Party, right?
Here we are.
And so he has to try and sound bullish.
One final question about this. Carrie Lam, the
chief executive.
The chief executive appointed by Beijing on Monday before that occupation. She gave this speech saying we should have listened more, showing more contrition. What's her standing?
It's not enough. It's not enough. Already in the past decade, Hong Kong students have demonstrated against changes to the education curriculum. That was pushed aside. That was completely abandoned. They've also gone against the national security law. They demonstrated against that was abolished. Carrie Lam is still saying this is just shelved. It's not going to come back. And no one believes her. No one really believes her. She has no credibility. She'll keep her job because she can't give them her scalp just yet. I think within 6 months or a year, she could be out, but not yet.
All right, let's look ahead to next Sunday, the Women's World Cup final here in France. It features...
I thought you were going to talk about the Greek election. You mean there's a football game on Sunday?
There's a football game. There's more than one. There's several. It features the defending champions against the European champions. But before we look ahead to USA-Netherlands, we got the answer to that goal celebration. Team USA's Alex Morgan insists her tea drinking simulation was not to rub salt in the wounds of her English semifinal opponents. She claims it was a nod to Game of Thrones actress Sophie Turner.
It wasn't a hit to England in any way. Secondly, I feel that there is some sort of double standard in for females in sports, men celebrating all around the world in big tournaments, grabbing their sacks or whatever it is. And when I look at sipping a cup of tea, I'm a little taken aback.
Gregory
I
Viscusi?
think she's wrong. She's missing something there. She's bringing American sports culture to Europe. That's the issue. Because European soccer players actually don't trash talk each other much, and they don't mock each other on the. No, they really don't. They really don't. It's not part of the. It's much more part of the game in the U.S. This is not a male-female thing. This is a Europe-America thing, and that's part of why her gesture.
Do you believe her when she says she wasn't trash talking the English?
No.
She was.
I think so. I mean, come on, it's a bit obscure. The Game of Thrones actress. I mean, sort of a strange,
Paul Taylor?
Well, it was rather cultured if she took it back to the Boston Tea Party, after all. A sense of history is not out of place on the soccer field, I would have thought.
Do you agree, though, with Gregory that goal celebrations in Europe don't involve trash talking?
Oh, goal celebrations in Europe involve all sorts of vulgarity as well.
No, but they don't mock the other. I mean, you don't mock the other team when you score. You celebrate. Right. You don't mock the other team.
Yeah, you glorify yourself rather than mocking the other side.
At worst, you run over to the opposing fans and kind of like celebrate in front of them.
They haven't got as far as dancing the haka yet. Yeah, when the women's soccer team start
mocking, the haka's not mocking. No.
It's all about swagger. Right? I mean, the American team, anything they do there, they're accused of arrogance. They're taken to task. I mean, you remember the tie game, right? 13-0. And,
there was a lot of criticism over the fact that when you run up the score, at one point you have to stop celebrating goals.
Why? I mean, as the coach said, why should they not celebrate?
Greg will tell you that it's bad form.
Way over the top.
No, because you could make the case it would actually be an insult to your opponent if you didn't celebrate.
Well, in Italy, after 4 goals,
this is a real match.
Nothing to get excited about. Another goal. There we go.
They're in the World Cup. They want to.
This is such an American attitude, isn't it?
As I said, this is
winners here.
So if you score the 12th goal in the World Cup just because you happen to be the 12th, well, I think that was also
come on,
Alex Morgan. You're not supposed to be celebrating.
This wasn't.
It was against Thailand. They could barely afford. They could barely afford their shoes. Those girls.
I would definitely be. I would celebrate myself. But then I'm too American, I suppose. Right?
Well, as a New Zealander, I remember when we were in the World Cup, the Football World Cup in Spain, and some team, which will remain nameless, scored 12 goals against us, and they didn't celebrate.
Well, they were very restrained.
They were very restrained.
All right, just before we finish, let's go around the room. Prediction.
2-1 to the US.
I think I'm not going to put a score. I think the Americans are definitely, they're the best team out there. But they've been run close in the last 3 games. I mean, they needed a very soft penalty to see off Spain. The French should have had a penalty in the dying minutes that would have made it 2-2. I don't think that English goal should have been turned down. So it's not a done deal. I mean, the Americans certainly, they've got the depth, they've got the experience, but it's not a done deal.
No, I mean, I would normally agree with that, but then again, I was such a lackluster semifinal match with the Netherlands. It
was not lackluster. I think people are missing the point of that game. Get used to that kind of a game in women's football, because that game to me for the women's football is advancing
level that I've seen in the American team.
It was a very, very tactical match in which the 2 teams neutralized each other, and that's what men's football is all about. Get used to that coming in the women's
politics.
game.
It's all politics, right? After Trump's victory parade, wouldn't it be nice to see the woman who said she'd refused to go to the White House?
Celebrate because of Rapinoe. He can't celebrate. He can't celebrate this. So it's
going to be nice to see her.
But the rest of the team said they will go, right?
So, no, they said they go. They either all go
or they all won't.
Or they all won't.
Okay, it is.
So let's hopefully the Dutch win and they're solved that.
You're right. I think if the Dutch get a bit physical and get in their faces,
they can stop them from playing. The 2 centre backs, Ornato is there. They're a bit shaky. The 2 centre backs.
All right, France 24 will be covering with Kedevan Gorgestani in Lyon. Many thanks for that, Gregory Viscusi, Catherine Field, Douglas Herbert, Paul Taylor. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
Golly, that parade on Thursday for Independence Day, it's the gift that keeps on giving.
Yes, there's plenty more still to be said about it today. It did literally rain on his parade. However, a lot of people feared that this was going to be a horribly partisan affair, that it was going to basically amount to a 2020 re-election rally on a day where
Republican donors got the best seats.
Absolutely, and that is still not being greeted terribly positively by lots of people. However, a lot of people felt that, broadly speaking, he kind of struck the right note with that speech. Fox News, his number 1 fan club, unsurprisingly calling it patriotic, non-partisan and unifying. It would appear, though, that the new White House press secretary didn't quite get the memo on the fact that this is supposed to be about Independence Day, not the president, because what she tweeted out was this, very much putting Independence Day as in second billing. Incredible to see all in attendance to hear our President speak and celebrate our great nation's Independence Day. Of course, the other big thing that everyone is talking about is the fact that he did give his critics plenty of food for ammunition, really, when he chose to go a little bit wrong when it came to matters of history. Take a listen to this.
Our army manned the airport. It ran the ramparts. It took over the airports. It did everything it had to do. And at Fort McHenry, under the rocket's red glare, it had nothing but victory.
He lost Baltimore with that one because he mispronounced Fort McHenry.
There were so many errors in there, but obviously the big one is the fact that he talked about airports more than a century before any plane had ever taken to the skies.
That's fake news.
It is fake news, and it is rather unfortunate. So yes, clearly a lot of people fact-checking it, but that was the one that none of us needed to really do any consulting on because clearly that wasn't happening in the 1700s. The Washington Post does talk about a lot of the other errors. They're documented in this piece. It's also interesting they've updated it to tell us that Donald Trump has said that his teleprompter broke down because of the rain. It was actually hard to look at it anyway, he says, because there was rain all over it. But he claims that it went down in the middle of that sentence. So it would appear it was a very unfortunate ad-lib. If not, then a speechwriter's certainly going to be getting the sack, I think it would be fair to say. However, this error has prompted a wonderful wealth of things on Twitter. The hashtag Revolutionary War Airport Stories has been doing the rounds. Actual footage of the US Army storming the airports during the War of 1812. Because that was his other error. He kept confusing the War of Independence with the one in 1812. This one, the Battle of Baggage Claim, 1776. Many lives were lost and bags too. Fabulous stuff. People are incredibly creative. This one, who among us shall ever forget Washington's glorious siege at Pan Am? And I think my favourite one of all is this one. Will my emotional support animal require an extra seat when it's to Washington? And his wonderful grey horse.
Oh dear. Yes, emotional. Because that's been a big problem in the US, emotional support animals. Turning our attention, though, to the cinema.
Indeed. A very different story. And I would just like to point out at the beginning of this, mermaids are not real. Because it appears a lot of people have forgotten this. Disney has announced a new live-action movie version of The Little Mermaid. They have cast this lady, Halle Bailey, or Halle Bailey, I guess her name is, not Halle Berry, as lots of people have been thinking, as The Little Mermaid, Ariel. And of course, you can see that there's a very distinct difference between her and her cartoon predecessor. Something that she was extremely pleased about. She's described it as a dream come true. Lots of other people took to Twitter to say that really it was their nightmare come true. You'd think they'd have more things to worry about. When a tweet starts with, first of all, I'm not a racist, you know you're in trouble. I love Halle, she says, but I won't let Disney ruin our childhood memories. So I started a petition to get justice for Ariel and our childhood memories.
Wow.
Yes, she's not alone in that. It is quite exceptional. But the really nice thing is the hashtag #NotMyAriel started to trend. However, all the hateful racist stuff has been completely swamped by people saying things like this. I'm offended by the casting of a woman of colour as Ariel. They should have used an actual real mermaid. Sick and tired of this human privilege. One other creative one, which I particularly love.
The Mermaid Liberation Front.
Absolutely. This is a take on the distracted boyfriend meme that we've all seen many, many times. Prince Eric there with the original Ariel and taking a very good look at the new version.
Many thanks for that, Emma and James. We'll have more tales of...
Oh, very good.
Fishy tales.
Coming up later. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.